together and I'll demonstrate how we can use all of these skills in a full system at this point in your progress. We'll be using the curriculum that we have available. If you haven't looked at this yet, it gives you an overview of everything to expect in the entire learning system, or at least the major points, and it's been designed in a way that you can use as a practice resource. So I'll be going through that and I'll be showing you how you can actually be applying these skills. It's going to be best for you to give this a go by yourself first so that you can actually compare what you were able to do with what I'm going to do. If you don't try it yourself first and you just watch this video and you just see how I do it, then you're not going to get as much value from it. You won't have made certain mistakes and you're not going to pick up on certain details and nuances in the way that I'm doing the technique if you haven't had some of that experience in the past before. So if at this stage you haven't tried using your full set of techniques on studying that material, then I'd recommend you go through and do so now and then come back to this. If you've already done that and you've got your work in front of you, then we can go into a comparison mode. I'm going to assume that you've done that, and so I'm not going to be talking about a lot of the smaller little mini steps. I will be trying to narrate some of the important decisions that I'm making in the learning process, but just note that I am going to be expecting that there is inherent relevance to you because you've already had the experience of trying to do it yourself. So let's jump onto the computer and see how I'm going to study this with a fundamentals level of skill. So I've got my tablet here in front of me and I'm ready to go through the material. I'm going to make sure that I scope everything out first, and so in a video setting, like a online recorded lecture, one of the ways that you can do that is to simply skim through it as quickly as possible. There may be a guide that's already presented for you that has all the main concepts. It could be lecture slides, in which case you may not even need to listen to the lecture recording first, especially if you are doing this and no recordings are even available whatsoever, either before the lecture and they haven't released anything, or even afterwards they may not give you some kind of recording. Even in that type of situation, you can just use at least whatever is available for you. So for example, what we've done is we've made it easier for you by actually giving you a list of all the concepts. So you don't have to go through and listen to the entire thing and collect all those keywords. We've actually done that step for you to save a bit of time. However, if that wasn't available, then I would just be listening to this double speed, or what you can sometimes do is download the file and then put it through some kind of transcription software. There's lots of different speech to text transcribing softwares that are out there that you can look for. You can plug it into one of those and that will actually get all of the words that were spoken and put them into text so that you can skim through it very quickly. Some of them cost money, but they may be worth it in the end. So either way, we're going to go through and have an understanding about what's going to be covered in the topic and end up with the first step, which is just collecting a list of basic keywords around what the topic is about. This is a great step to start with, and it's a good way to begin the very first step, which is our pre-study and priming. Now, my main objective here is to just build that basic knowledge schema using some non-linear note-taking and just create some very, very simple groups. This is not a super time-consuming process, and it really shouldn't be something that you allow yourself to spend that much time on, because it might mean that you're focusing on too many of the details too early. So let's download this concepts list to help us. And while we're at it, we're also going to download a few other things. We'll download this summary document here. And we're going to download our textbook, which in this case is the report on learning document. Let's open up all of the documents so that we can look through them all. We know that the report on learning document is going to be a more like that textbook. It's denser, it's more technical, it's deeper, and it covers some of the material in a way that is not necessarily relevant for this particular lesson, but it could help us to understand and deepen our knowledge either now or later when we're studying through it properly. But for now, we're not going to focus on it too much because all we're looking for is to build that basic understanding for our pre-study and our priming. The summary document, which could be like a lecture guide or some kind of course guide or something, this is going to be really useful because it allows us to, again, skim through and get some of those main ideas and just understand some of those main relationships. So we'll start here with just the concepts list. And looking through this, I already have some very, very simple ideas about ways that I may possibly group it. So if you look through this list, you will also find possible ways that you can group it. And it doesn't mean that that is the group that you will always end up with. It could just be an idea of a group that you have, and you can use that as a hypothesis to build off of next. But what's important is that we do at least build that hypothesis. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the concepts list, and I'm going to go through the summary document, and then I'm going to just try to create general big groups and general relationships and express them out here on my map software. As usual, I'm using Concepts for this, which is the name of the app. All right, so right now what I've been doing is I've just been going through the list of keywords, and I've just been grouping things together in what just intuitively feels like they're probably talking about more similar things. So for example, when I read the word retention, I'm feeling like it's going to be a very different thing from the word motivation, which I've written here. And you can see that I've actually grouped it differently. Now, it may end up being that these two actually do belong in the same group later. However, for now, I'm happy with just leaving them separate because it just feels as though they would be separated, and just in my very simplistic view. And this basic ability to group information is already activating some higher order thinking. I'm comparing ideas against each other. I'm looking for similarities and differences, and I'm just trying to get a sense for how the information might fit. Already, I'm starting to see how some groups may affect other groups. But right now, I'm not really caring too much about that. I'm just trying to create some very, very basic groups. One thing that will be different with your experience of doing this is that you may not know straight away, looking at all the keywords, what it actually means. And so you may need to spend a little bit of time to read up about it, either in the textbook that we've got available here, or in the summary document, or through Google. Now, I'm not going to show you all of those steps because they're relatively simple, but I will just demonstrate that with just one. So here we've got the idea of microlearning. Now, I haven't yet written microlearning on my schema yet. So if I read that word and I didn't know what the word meant, and let's say that this wasn't available for us, this list, and so we're collecting the word from scratch, in that case, I would be listening to the video or looking at the transcript or looking through the textbook or the guide or whatever other resource, and I would have seen this as a heading or a bold word or a paragraph that talks about it, and I would have thought, this looks important, and that's why I wrote it down. But at the time, maybe I didn't read up enough about it to really have an understanding about what it meant. And that can commonly be the case if you're looking at it from, for example, just a lecture transcript, in which case you don't really have the time to listen, to the 2 to 3 minutes before and after every single word to figure out what it means. In that case, you just may as well watch the whole lecture, and that's not going to be very time efficient. So in this is sort of, a worst case scenario. A word is on here. I have no idea what it means. I don't even remember where I found it from. I don't know anything about it. All I know is that it looked like an important concept, so I wrote it down, and I need to figure out where I'm going to group this. So here's exactly what I would do. I'll look through probably the densest, most comprehensive resource that's available for me. In this case, it's going to be this textbook. So I'm just going to very quickly go through here, and I'm going to search for the word micro learning to see if it comes up. That didn't come up. I'll search for the word micro. So that didn't come up either. So that suggests that that word isn't in this resource. I'll look through this course guide. I'll look for the word microlearning again. So here we see the word microlearning has appeared in the middle of the page. So I'm just going to read this paragraph very briefly. So after reading this, we can see that it doesn't really help very much. We know that there's some relationship with interleaving and spacing. However, it's not enough for us to really get an understanding about what it means. So I'll very quickly Google it. One of the first things that I'll usually do for something like terminology is I'll straight away go to Google Images, because often there can be a diagrammatic representation that just shows me straight away what the gist of it is without having to read through too many articles. And I can see at a glance all the different sources of information from multiple different websites without clicking into each individual link and reading through it. Again, I'm leveraging that ability for visual processing in something as small as this. So I can see a little table here. That looks quite good. Let's see if this is going to be relevant for me. So I'll open this in a new tab, and we'll just zoom in on this. So from reading this table, I'm getting the idea that microlearning is about things that are very short in intervals. They're usually more isolated based on single concepts or skills. It doesn't look like there are too many other major differences from this. So I'm getting a general gist of what microlearning might mean. So let's look at some of this other material here. So here's another thing. So let's open this one in a new tab. You can see where all these are coming from. This one is coming from TechTarget. This one is coming from Venngage. So this is obviously a little bit more comprehensive now. So again, I'm getting the idea of indexing and doing things in compressed time periods. But another thing I'm seeing is that this is a lot to do with how you should teach in microlearning rather than an individual learning with microlearning. And that's kind of a different angle. So I want to learn a little bit more about this. I can see that it can be really effective, supporting long-term retention by up to 80%. So there's obviously something that's really significant about this. That's a little bit too much. Microlearning, bite-sized knowledge. There's the idea of self-paced. So already I'm starting to get a general understanding of it. I don't have a clear picture yet. I couldn't really explain it to someone, but the trends I'm getting are that it is small steps of learning and shorter time intervals. And apparently it's very effective. So it's saying here again, like less than 10 minutes. So now I feel I have a general enough understanding of microlearning to start thinking about how it could fit in. So if I look again in comparison with all the other concepts that are on this list and I'm thinking about how it's relevant, well, now I can start to see how spacing and space retrieval might be relevant to microlearning, because spacing is the idea of taking time and having gaps between these sessions, and then microlearning are these small sessions. So maybe it's the idea of having small sessions and then spacing those small sessions out. So I'm getting a general understanding of it. Again, not very deep, but that's all I need to just create this hypothesis of this frame. So I'm actually going to put microlearning over here right next to where I had all my stuff about spacing. So I would go through and do that for this entire group of information. So I'm going to finish off this basic grouping, and then we'll go into how we're then transforming that into something that is a nonlinear representation of ideas and how we're going to use the remaining resources. So first, I'll just create my basic hypothesis of my groups. And again, for most people, this is going to be a process where you're going back and forth and looking at Google and Google Images and things like, just like I have for a lot of these keywords. A lot of the time you won't have to do that. You will have an idea about what some of those keywords mean, especially if you have pretty good prior knowledge. We'll talk in later stages about how that prior knowledge can actually be deceiving and actually can hold you back from creating some good groups, but that's a little bit advanced for right now. All we're worried about right now is creating some pretty decent groups, doing that back and forth higher order thinking to figure out what makes sense, and then trying to represent that in our notes somehow. So let me just go ahead and finish this concepts list. Good, so I finished this concepts list, and I should note that the groups that I formed are not necessarily the groups you should form. And in fact, they're actually not the best groups. I've deliberately grouped them in a way that I think someone that is at the fundamentals level may group them. In fact, there are actually much better ways that it can be grouped, and there's much more that can be done with this. But I've just left it like this for now as a demonstration. So don't feel that you need to follow and copy the groups that I've created necessarily. The other thing is that while I'm doing this, I'm thinking about how each of these different things is also related to each other. So I'm sort of building a disorganized, very basic web of knowledge. However, what's also important is that thinking of relationships and back and forth, that nature of thinking can be quite overwhelming. So it's actually very normal, even during this initial process, to feel quite overwhelmed, because now you're going through all these concepts and thinking there are so many keywords and concepts and things to know. There's so much to know, and then a lot of students will at that point feel very pressured to start just learning more about it, to just start tackling this big workload. And while that's understandable because there seems like a mountain of work, we better get started and dive into it, we need to actually hold off on that. So understand that it's normal for this process here to feel quite overwhelming, but it's important to stick with the technique, because a little bit of preparation work before we dive into it is going to make it much easier for for us to process the information in the first place, and for us to eventually hold on to that information and use it to a higher level. So these are all very important subtleties with the technique that, again, you've probably already experienced when you were doing it. Maybe you found that you went halfway through this process and you sort of stopped. Right now, this did not take me very long. I believe it took around about 10 minutes or so for me to actually finish doing all of this. In reality, for you, if for an entire topic like this, and this would be considered a reasonably large topic, this may take you something like 20 or 30 minutes. But again, not that long. It would only take long if you start going too deep into every single word to figure out exactly what it means. But just remember the example I gave before. All I needed was that general understanding, that very superficial level understanding, to just start thinking about how it could be grouped together. That's all that's important at that pre-study stage. So if this is all you were able to do before you went into the lecture, that would still already be a win, but ideally we want to push that a little bit further. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to label some of these groups. I'm going to add some keywords to represent what each of these groups actually mean, and I'm going to start trying to map it out so I can see some of these relationships. While I'm doing that, I'm going to notice that some of the things that I grouped aren't actually grouped in the way that it really should be. Some of these things are grouped in ways that I felt it should be grouped, but now that I look at the relationships, I'll realize that I want to move things around. And again, that's normal and that's okay. You can reorganize your groups as you're doing this relationship and mapping process. The other thing that I'll be looking at is simplifying some of these groups. For example, you can see in this group, there are many items. That's going to be overwhelming. So I'm going to look at how I can create subgroups within each of these groups. But the first thing to do is just generally label what each of these things are. So I'll just do that in red here. So you'll see that when I grouped these things together, I'm giving them keywords that are very easy and simple to understand. And it's important to do this because, number one, it actually makes us to think again at a higher order by relating it to the things that we already know and find intuitive. For example, thinking about problems or outcomes, this is something that doesn't require me to study more to understand. I already know how to think about outcomes or problems or skills or planning. So because I'm using simpler language, this allows me to think about how the groups are related to each other a little bit more simply. But as I'm doing this, I'm also now seeing some issues. So for example, I'm thinking that spacing is actually really a type of skill, as is planning. So now I'm inclined to actually make both of these subgroups within skills. And again, this is normal, and we're going to be reorganizing this as we go. Another thing that you might notice is that I've used a word like self-management here as the label for this group, even though that exact same term is inside that group. It's one of the keywords, one of the concepts inside the group, and I've used the same wording. Again, here I've called this spacing, but spacing is actually one of these words. And again, that is fine as well. Sometimes you'll find that one concept really does summarize all of these sub-concepts, and you can use that as a word as long as that word feels intuitive and simple enough. If it's a brand new piece of terminology that you've just come to, and just thinking about what that word even means already takes up effort, you don't want to use that as the name for your group, because then it's going to become overwhelming to think about how all of it is connected together. So in this case, self-management, I feel pretty happy with calling it that because it seems simple and intuitive enough. Spacing, likewise, feels intuitive enough, so I'm happy to label it like that too. So now I'm just going to go through and create some basic maps where I feel confident with. And as I'm creating some of these maps, I'm going to try to simplify some of these groups to see if I can break them down into subgroups. And you will see that as I do this, there's a lot of thinking about it. There's a lot of back and forth, and I'll be reorganizing things every now and again. I'll be breaking some of the groups and redistributing some of those concepts to other groups. I may even end up creating some new groups depending on how I feel about this process. Now, again, this depends on your skill level and the size of the topic. This entire process, including what I'm about to do next, may only take you 20 or 30 minutes. Or in some cases, if you're doing, let's say, an entire week's worth of content, it might take you an hour or so. And again, as long as the amount of time you're spending on it is small relative to the total scope, for example, For 1 hour, I'd usually recommend no more than sort of 15 minutes. Whereas if you're doing sort of 5 hours worth of lecture material, you may legitimately spend 45 minutes to an hour to cover it. So just keep that in mind. You shouldn't ever let yourself take too long, because it likely means that you're getting sucked into the details too much, and that's going to be a technique issue, and it's going to make things much more difficult. So let's go through and create this basic map. So I've created a general frame, and you can already see how this entire topic is starting to actually look like it makes more sense. Now, again, I will say I've deliberately made a few mistakes here that will be common for someone at the fundamentals level to make. And you'll see how the more advanced strategies, although they're more difficult to actually use, and it requires you to have a certain level of habitual processing ability, and usage of some of these basic techniques to be able to pull it off, how those techniques can actually avoid these mistakes. They're very difficult to avoid otherwise. One thing that can help to catch these errors is, again, by really thinking about the groups you've formed and whether the individual concepts within them make sense. So, for example, I've grouped this as research and improvement. But now that I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking, well, do each of these things fall within the idea that that is contributing to research that allows us to produce these skills? I'm thinking, not really, because some of these things, namely these ones here, these are not actually to do with the research. This is actually about our ability to practice it and develop the right skills. So actually, I'm going to need to create an entirely new chunk based on this, and I'm going to call this practice. And I'm going to add that in here. In this case, it ended up being quite clean. I could simply just add it on underneath, and it still looks relatively clean. But in a lot of cases, probably most cases, you would actually have to break your structure, move things around, or in some cases actually just start it from scratch, because you realize that there's a better way and a simpler way of grouping that information. Now, within skills right now, I would have two items. I'll highlight them here. I would have grouping and note-taking. So I'm going to say that's fine. I could add that underneath there. Under self-management, I would have motivation, discomfort, habits, time and task management, procrastination, and focus. That's a little bit much. There's this thing called the 2-4 rule, which means that we want to aim for 2 and at most 4 points under any individual group. So right now we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different points. So I'm going to find a way to subgroup that. So I would maybe think of motivation and habits and time and task management, or maybe motivation, habits, and discomfort in one group, and then focus, procrastination, time and task management as another group. I could think, in my mind, I'm thinking about it in terms of self-management of feelings versus self-management of maybe actions or behaviors. So I could do self-management of, let's say, emotions, and then self-management of actions. Again, the labels that I'm giving are very simple terminology, nothing that I have to think too much about. So how would I actually add the information underneath this general frame? So I would literally do it like this. So for example, if under emotions, we're talking about motivation, and let's actually say motivation, discomfort, and procrastination, because that's probably a bit more accurate. I would literally write it like this. I would just write motivation, procrastination, and discomfort. As simple as that. I'm not going to do that for the entire map just to save some time, but you can see how I would be adding things on for everything else. So similarly for actions, I will be adding on time and task management. And I'd also be adding on focus here as well. I think there's one more that we're missing, which is habits. As we continue to learn more in the later stages, this can be built on progressively more and more and more. So for example, we might find that there is a relationship between motivation and procrastination and habits, in which case we may actually want to represent that these things are actually related to each other, like that. So we could create this type of relationship. But you'll find that it's very messy to create relationships if you don't do the overall structure very well, because you'll end up with points that are sort of one out here and then one over here, and then you realize they're related together, and you draw this big arrow going across, and then that's related to this thing, and that's related to this thing, and that's related to this thing, and it becomes impossible to follow. And that would be because things that really should have been in the same group were kept in different groups. And so we're trying to represent the relationship spreading across the entire map. That's an issue with the way that we created the groups in the first place. So again, spending a bit of time to really get the groups good as possible in the first place pays off in the long run. Likewise, with a group like practice, you can see that there are multiple different points here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And again, I'd just be thinking about how I can subgroup that into maybe 3 different subgroups, maybe even 4 different subgroups, so that I could branch that off, and that would look something like this, something like that. And then I'll be able to fill that in. So I'd continue with this process until I feel like I've covered all of those major key concepts and keywords. And I'd end up with a map that allows you to have a surprisingly good level of understanding about the topic, even though you haven't really spent a very long time actually learning it in that much detail. And that means that when you go into the lecture or whatever main learning event there is, you've got a much better frame of mind, and you're able to engage with the material much more actively, and you can engage in that higher order thinking much more easily as well. Now, that learning event may not actually be a lecture. It could just be a serious study session. So you might do this on a weekend, and you know that, or maybe you do this on, let's say, a Wednesday, because you know that on the Saturday you're having a really, really big study session. So you could time it that way, where on that particular day, on the Wednesday, you just do this frame, so that on the Saturday, you're really ready to just dive into the material and start learning about it in much more depth. So let's assume that we've created a frame like this. It's a little bit more fleshed out. What are we going to do on the day when we're actually learning and we're actually studying all of that stuff? Well, we'll be going through, and we'll be going through all of our resources, our textbook. We'll be going through the video in itself, much more in depth and properly. And this is naturally a time-consuming process, but it's the same amount of time you would normally spend. You're still having to read things, you're still having to listening to things. You can't skip the step of consuming information. That information has to enter your brain somehow. We're saving time by making it so that when the information enters into your brain is able to use it more quickly in a more meaningful way that produces a higher level of memory and retention, so that it's not slipping away so quickly and then you have to spend more time to relearn it again and again and again. So we can't save that much time on the raw consuming of information other than listening to videos at double speed or learning to read more quickly. But again, even that, there's limited returns. You can save maybe 30 minutes, an hour or so for a single study session, which may seem like a lot, and it is decent. However, when you think about it in terms of weeks of studying, an hour a day of saving is actually not that much if you're considering that some of these skills will allow you to actually make entire days of studying completely unnecessary because you just didn't forget everything that you would normally spend that time to relearn. Or that you needed to reach a higher level, because you're able to reach that level much more quickly. So when we're going through this and we're thinking about all the new things that we could add on here. So for example, in this textbook, the Report on Learning, there's a lot of information here about cognitive load theory. So what can we do? As we're learning about cognitive load theory, we could start going into this. So let's say cognitive load theory is, I believe I put it under learning processes. So under learning processes, let's say that there is a chunk coming out here called cognitive load theory. And this is not necessarily exactly how it looked, but this is the gist of it. We'd be going through, and any pertinent ideas about it, we could literally just add on to here. And for now, I'm happy for you to just write it down, simplify the words, add visuals in areas where you feel like you don't need to add words. I haven't added any visuals here so far at the moment, because I haven't really felt the need to, because it's all felt very intuitive. However, if there is any point that I feel like I might forget this, or this is very wordy and I feel like this is not this is a very obtuse, unnecessary way of expressing this idea, then I wouldn't really go into all of those words. I would be just diving through and drawing some images and abstracting on it and using my visualizations for that instead. And you see that in the other examples that I give throughout the program. So I'm going to I'm going to add whatever information. I'm going to try to keep it simple. I'm not going to make it too wordy. I'll use visualizations wherever I feel like I need that memory boost. And every now and again, I'm going to rearrange the map that I've created. I'm going to reorganize things. Even if you try your best, for most people, especially beginner and even intermediate level learners, you will end up with a map that looks very, very difficult to follow. There will be things going everywhere. It's going to be a mess. You'll create like a portal over here so that arrow can come through over here. You'll even if you put in all of your best effort, you will still end up with a very messy mind map. And that's normal as well. What you can do after that is to just clean that up. And that could actually even be a form of interleaved retrieval for you. You could do that at the end of the week, on a weekend. You could say, I'm going to take this map, I'm going to clean it up and really organize my thoughts and really think about whether I've grouped them in the best way. If it's messy, there's probably a better way to group it. And it's on you to figure out what that better way is. So for example, if I didn't split research and improvement into research and practice, I would have ended up with heaps of different things over here. And then I would have realized that all of these things are related to these things. So I would have had arrows going in this direction. And then I would have realized that actually affects, for example, some of these skills. So that would have happened. And then that looks very, very messy. But now, because of the way that I've put it, I don't have to do that. I can represent it much more cleanly. I have the practice, and I could just simply say that is related to all of this here, like that, for example. And that would just show that relationship. So you can see how much cleaner it can be with better grouping. So if it's ending up looking quite messy and hard to follow, even at a glance, that tells you that there is improvement that can be made with the way that you've grouped it, the way that you've spaced things out, and how you're thinking about the relationships. Common issues at this point are thinking about the relationships afterwards. So if you go through to learn about it in detail and you just think about putting it all on the map, and then you think about how it's related together and how you could group it, that's going to be very, very difficult to do, because that becomes information listed on a page and then arrows done retrospectively. What's really common to see is you'd often see these kind of big blocks of text all over the page, and you'll see arrows kind of dodging and weaving in and out of the material, almost dodging the blocks of text. What that says is that the arrows were thought about after it was put on paper, which is the opposite way that we want it to be. We actually want it to be that we thought about the relationships before we even committed it, because that is the correct order of higher order thinking, rather than just thinking about isolated information first and then trying to connect it afterwards. We have to think about how it's related, create a place for that information to belong, and then we can add that information and it becomes immediately more relevant. In that main learning event, the day after, during that, that bulk of the studying period, we're going through the textbook, we're going through the other documents and resources, we're going through the videos, we're consuming the information and we're adding it to the map. We're thinking about where it belongs, we're connecting it with a purpose, a bigger picture, we're grouping it, we're thinking about relationships at every single step of the way. And then afterwards, we can clean that up. A week or so later, we can clean it up even further, or we can use some other form of interleaved retrieval. So, for example, I may decide that I'm at a point where I feel like I can teach someone this. So I may teach an imaginary student. I may create my own practice questions that are very difficult and use an extended method there. I may use an existing question bank and then add on additional value through creating my own answer sheet from that. I could have specific methods of using study groups. I could incorporate elements of memorization, for example, the things that I just didn't know how to fit onto this map. I could put those onto my flashcards, and therefore I could just do those flashcards in a parallel stream whenever I've got time here and there in a true micro-learning fashion. So these are the other supplements that you would have. I'm not going to demonstrate that because it's relatively straightforward, and there are, just dozens of different methods of interleaving that are available for you that you can read through in the interleaving table. But if you're able to do this, and on the background of this, you're managing yourself well with good time and task management, you're prioritizing, you're using your practice blocks that you can develop these skills. If you're finding it really difficult to do this, it means that you do need more practice. And that practice has to come from you scheduling and putting that time in. So that comes back to the self-management skills. So if we've got the right self-management skills, time management, task management, marginal gains, we're being quite reflective, we're looking at growth in terms of the mistakes we're making and figuring out what mistakes we're likely to make at an early stage with our practice blocks. And then we're actually practicing it consistently. We're doing our nonlinear note taking, we're forming groups, we're thinking about relationships, we're mapping it out generally, we're spending a bit more time processing the information in our head instead of just putting it out there. We're using some visualizations to abstract it, and then we're applying good spaced interleaved retrieval. If we're using all of those things, then we're already halfway there on our journey. Issues start arising when just even one of those components is missing. This is a very complicated cake, and even one of those ingredients not being there means that the cake doesn't really rise. So it's important to check off all of those things. So take a moment to reflect on yourself in terms of how you would study this material or how you have studied this material. Think about the things that you could improve on before moving on to the next stages.